Hello everybody and welcome to a new masterclass within the Master's Degree in Military History of INISEG. My name is Juan Alarcón, Professor on China-Taiwan Relations at INISEG, and I'm your host as always. Today we go back to the Vietnam War after some time revisiting World War II, as you well know. Lotus in a Sea of Fire, US Army Mobile Advisory Teams and Territorial Soldiers in Vietnam. That is the title of today's lecture. And our distinguished speaker is Dr. Nguyễn Hồng Uyên from Texas Tech University. But before welcoming our guest, we'll begin, as always, with a brief introduction to our topic by Professor David Cachal, who is Director of the Master's Degree in Military History and its Research Group. David, how are you doing? ¿Cómo estás, compañero?
Muy bien, Juanjo. Muchas gracias. Preparado para una nueva interesante masterclass.
Okay, perfect. Don't be shy. Go ahead with your brief analysis.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, en esta breve introducción histórica que nos va a preceder con la intervención de la profesora Nguyễn Hồng Uyên de la Universidad de Texas sobre la guerra de Vietnam. Hay que ponernos en contexto histórico los orígenes de la guerra de Vietnam, que se sitúa después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. El sentimiento antiimperialista que se extendía por las colonias europeas llegó hasta la región de Indochina, entonces controlada por Francia. Las hostilidades entre las tropas coloniales y el Vietnam, la guerrilla independentista liderada por Ho Chi Minh, dieron lugar a la guerra de Indochina entre 1946 y 1954. El conflicto terminó con la firma de los Acuerdos de Ginebra, que llevaron a decretar la independencia de las colonias de Indochina y la participación de Vietnam en dos estados. El norte estaría controlado por los comunistas, mientras que el sur estaría vinculado a Occidente. Asimismo, los pactos establecían la celebración de un referéndum para decidir la unificación o la fragmentación definitiva del territorio. El miedo de Estados Unidos a un Vietnam unificado bajo el comunismo impidió la consulta. En plena Guerra Fría, la administración de Dwight D. Eisenhower temía un efecto dominó en la región. Para evitarlo, Washington envió asistencia económica y militar a Vietnam del Sur. La negativa del Estado subvietnamita a celebrar el referéndum exacerbó los ánimos del Frente Nacional de Liberación de Vietnam, conocido como el Vietcong. La nueva milicia de Ho Chi Minh comenzaba a operar para derrocar al gobierno de Ngo Diem Diem. Y también hay que recordar que la escasa preparación del ejército subvietnamita favorecía la incursión de la guerrilla. A ello se sumaba la inestabilidad de la autocracia nepotista que había instaurado Diem, el descontento de la mayoría budista contra el presidente católico que llevó a Estados Unidos a apoyar un golpe de Estado en 1963 durante el mandato de John Fitzgerald Kennedy y hasta su asesinato. Los norteamericanos habían incrementado su presencia en el sur de Vietnam. Sin embargo, el curso de la guerra era desfavorable para sus intereses, más aún con la entrada del ejército de Vietnam del Norte en el verano de 1964, ante la caída inminente de la capital, Saigón. El sucesor de Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, decidió intervenir más allá en Vietnam. El casus belli se produjo el 4 de agosto en el Golfo de Tonkin. Según la versión norteamericana, varias lanchas patrulleras de Vietnam del Norte habían atacado dos destructores de Estados Unidos, cuando estos se adentraron en aguas que los comunistas reivindicaban como propias. Pese a que nunca hubo evidencias del ataque, Johnson lo utilizó como pretexto para solicitar al Congreso una intervención directa de Estados Unidos en la guerra de Vietnam. Tras el triunfo de las elecciones del 64, Johnson autorizó la operación Rolling Thunder, que iniciaría su despliegue militar. Las primeras tropas desembarcaron en la base aérea de Da Nang 6 días después, el 8 de marzo del 65. 3.500 marines norteamericanos se unían a los más de 60.000 asesores del ejército norteamericano que ya estaban destinados y desplegados en el país. Durante su mandato, Johnson aumentó la presencia militar en territorio vietnamita hasta alcanzar los 536.000 soldados en 1968. Sin embargo, la inexperiencia de las jóvenes tropas norteamericanas, su desconocimiento del terreno y el apoyo de China y de la Unión Soviética al Vietcong hicieron fracasar la intervención. La participación de Estados Unidos en Vietnam fue controversial entre su población. Los bombardeos televisados, las 58.000 bajas del ejército estadounidense, generaron un gran rechazo social, con las pequeñas protestas estudiantiles en 1965, extendidas entre los sectores izquierdistas, pacifistas y hippies de todo el país. Y con ello finalizo esta pequeña introducción histórica, dando paso a nuestra ponente invitada. Juanjo, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David, for such a brief and interesting analysis at the same time. A good appetizer to start with. And now, it's the time to welcome our guest, Dr. Nguyễn Hồng Uyên. How are you doing, ma'am? Welcome to INISEG. It's an honor for us to have you here again.
Yes, it's my honor to be here. Thank you, Professor Juanjo.
Oh, bueno, Juanjo, but anyway.
Juanjo, okay.
I don't know if I have pronounced well your name. It's Nguyễn Hồng Uyên, correct?
That's correct. Thank you.
Okay. In any case, it is an Nguyen. It is an Nguyen, right? It's Nguyễn Hồng Uyên.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Oh,
I love how you say the last name in one word.
okay, perfect. Dr. Uyên, before giving you the floor, let me read your brief resume. Is that okay with you?
Yes, thank you so
Okay,
much.
perfect. Dr. Nguyễn Hồng Uyên is a military historian and a research assistant professor at Texas Tech University with a joint appointment in the Institute for Peace and Conflict and the Department of History. She was born in Saigon in a family of 5. Her father served in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, exam, and her mother was one among countless Vietnamese war-displaced refugees from the Battle of Hue in 1968. Dr. Uyên received her PhD in 2022 from Texas Tech University. Her dissertation studies U.S. military history from the bottom-up approach, examining the cross-cultural experience of the U.S. Army's mobile advisory teams and Vietnamese counterparts, the local soldiers and their families living in rural villages and hamlets across South Vietnam. She teaches several courses at Texas Tech University, including War Memory and Commemoration and History of Small Wars, Insurgency and Counterinsurgency. And last but not least, she gave a lecture here at INISEG in the Vietnam War International Seminar held in 2023. So she's back home, as a matter of fact. Well, impressive CV indeed. I'm speechless, but fortunately, the one who gives the speech is not me. So without further ado, Dr. Uyên, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Very generous. So hello everyone and good evening to all students in Spain and everyone streaming in. So welcome to our masterclass in military history. It is my honor and privilege to be here today to share with you a part of my research, looking at this incredibly complex war from a bottom-up approach through the lens of some, American field advisor, the Vietnamese foot soldiers, advisees, and the local population. I also would like to take a moment to express my sincere appreciation for all participants in this masterclass as INISEG, scholars, historians, and audience who have given your time, attention, and interest to continue researching and learning about a conflict in my country that has traumatically impacted many generations of Vietnamese people from all sides involved. Let me see if I can click this. So I would like to start with the year 1967, which witnessed 2 pivotal events in the war. Both events will prove to us rather decisively that we cannot separate the military and civil aspect of the conflict in Vietnam, because it was a highly complex struggle in which multiple dimensions, such as social, economic, political, and military dimension, were intricately interconnected. The first event was the publication of Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire by the renowned Thích Nhất Hạnh, who often known for his works on engaged Buddhism and mindfulness practice in everyday life. I quoted the title of his first published book in English in my presentation title, in tribute to his lifelong advocacy for peace for the Vietnamese. As some of you may know that this respectable teacher finished his journey on Earth, and he completed that on January in 2022. So this book expressed the desire and struggle for a lasting, meaningful peace of the majority of Vietnamese people who were suffering tremendously and got entangled in the middle of this horrific multi-dimensional conflict. And they did not want to take any sides. As observed from his 1965 trip when Thích Nhất Hạnh went up to the Thu Bồn River to visit some remote villages like Sơn Thuận, Khương Bình, and Cà Tang, peasants in these villages hated both the NLF and the GEVN side. When being asked which side that they would follow, some peasants responded that we do not follow either. We follow the one who can end the war and guarantee that we can live, end quote. This feeling of the Vietnamese people reported by Thích Nhất Hạnh was very similar to an American advisor in King Phong province observed in 1969. He said, quote, "The farmers and fishermen in my district wanted to be left alone so they could work to provide for their families. They were not political, and most of them would fall in line with whoever was in power," end quote. The second event that I would like to talk about was the creation of the Office of Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, or CORDS, C-O-R-D-S, on May 28 of 1967. This office, under the direction of MACV, or U.S. Military Assistant Command Vietnam, was responsible for providing military and civil support of pacification in Vietnam. This was the first time in the history of this prolonged conflict that the U.S. formally integrated civil and military advisory efforts in support of government of Vietnam pacification into one single command. CORDS unify a wide range of various programs which had been operating independently and at times very disjointedly by either military or civilian agency. CORDS has 12 directories encompassing multiple American advisory elements, such as the territorial forces, the Chiêu Hồi or the Open Arms Amnesty Program, education, health, agriculture. In October 1967, CORDS created a new program. It's called the Mobile Advisory Teams, or throughout my presentation today, I would refer to them as MAT, M-A-T, to train the territorial forces, which we will discuss more in detail about each group within these forces in the next slide. So as you can see on this slide, I just want to give you an overview about the MAT team structure, which was very small. We have to take into consideration that this program came out when the war was approaching its Vietnamization phase, and many American personnel were being withdrawn. So manpower and resources were very limited. 5 men, right? We're looking at each team consisted of 2 officers and 3 enlisted men. And if they were fortunate, they would have an assigned Vietnamese army interpreter. You can tell that all MAT teams had a rough job and they worked very hard in Vietnam. You can imagine with 5 men, if one already been on, let's say, a radio watch at the team house, there would be only 2 of a 2-man team left to rotate between accompanying local unit on daylight operation or a night ambush setting up on top of all the advisory duty every day. Toward the end of the war, many MAT teams were downsized to only 3-man teams. MAT had multifaceted mission, including both combat and non-combat elements. Being Army Field Advisor, their primary mission was to advise and instruct their advisee on field fortification, barrier system, indirect fire support, small unit operation, with an emphasis on night operation, ambushes, patrol, weapons employment, and emergency medical care. However, what many people do not aware is that besides providing combat assistance and training on infantry techniques, Med advisor also help local officials like the village or the hamlet chief to develop their defense plans, collaborated with various agencies in the village. For example, in intelligence operation, support some civic programs, community development projects like building school, setting up the healthcare clinics, developing some agricultural programs to improve the villager living condition. Being rolled out rather late in the war, there was arguably no uniform set in stone procedure of how to utilize the MAD teams across South Vietnam. For example, in the Mekong Delta, some MAD teams had a contract agreement that clearly identified their mission, the duration of their team in a certain village, but that was not the consistent case everywhere else. Operating right in the middle of rural villages and hamlets, these advisors live with the Vietnamese civilian community and fight alongside their local advisee soldier, and in some area with the indigenous units, the ethnic minorities too. MAD team had to face unique challenges and constant mental stress, physical exhaustion, and the psychological terror from the irregular and regular, both combined warfare. Because their daily threat was consisted of both the North Vietnamese enemy main force unit and also those insurgents from the NLF or the National Liberation Front. And at the same time, MAD teams, they also had to build a mutually trusting relationship with their local counterparts. Another huge challenge for MAD advisor was the issue of language, cultural and linguistic barrier. Although some of them might already have had the benefit of attending some Vietnamese language course in the United States through the Defense Language Institute. And each MAD team, like I said in the previous slide, was often having an assigned interpreter, a local translator, but still the linguistic barrier remained very challenging. As one MAD advisor said, quote, "There are the cultural differences that can make even simple social exchanges exhausting, because you must constantly be on guard against the inadvertent offense to your counterparts and the local people, and be certain that you are being understood and that your intent is not being clouded by some nuance missed in translation." End quote. Each MAD experiences, I argue, that they vary significantly depending on where they were in Vietnam, when they were there, which year, which unit, which location. For example, perhaps there might be a regular unit base camp or the Navy CB close by that the MAD team, were in proximity to, and therefore they could possibly share some resources, food. But again, that was not the case everywhere else. MAD advisor also had to learn many differences across South Vietnam from big to small levels, such as the regional geography, cultural tradition, various ethnic groups. And in each region, they might have, their own political and religious sects. Local security situation might also be very different. And they also have to be mindful of the history of a very complex balance between the number of the enemy forces hiding in the jungle surrounding a village and the number of friendly forces inside the village. So the balance between the outside and the inside also impacted how each MAD team operated. The length of stay and rotation. Some mobile advisory team, they stay in an area for around 4 to 6 months, half a year, and then they move to another area. But some MAD never move and remain static in the same village, in the same area throughout their tour. So one important thing to always remember when we talk about mobile advisory team is that just like their fellow American, advisor who were assigned to a regular divisional unit, MAD advisor were functioning only within the advisory capacity, not in a commanding position to their respective counterparts. Advisor, not commander. So who were their advisee? Exactly. We shall find out in the next few slides. The first group of MAD advisee that I would like to discuss is the regional forces, or the RF. So the RF, they came from the Civil Guard under the First Republic of South Vietnam. And this was a paramilitary coalition which were activated way back in April 1955 with around 68,000 men from various elements of the First Indochina War period. So, they were a combination of people like the Vietnamese National Army, the French Union forces, and some of the discharged auxiliary forces from the Cao Đài, Hòa Hảo. Those were the Vietnamese political religious sects. Territorial forces were badly neglected until 1967, the year that I started the presentation with, when Vietnamization and pacification came more into the forefront. The creation of corps and MAD laid an important foundation for the build-up of these local units, especially after the Third Offensive or post-1968. I won't repeat, too much of the statistic that you can already see on the slide, but I would like to point out that you can see that within just about 3 years, right, the RF, you can see that they grew significantly and double its size, right, from 1967 to 1970. By 1973, right, the year that all American combat soldiers had left Vietnam, there were a total of 360 RF battalion that had been formed and fully employed by that time. They also bore the bigger burden of combat death, accounting for 55% of South Vietnamese killed in action from 1965 to 1972. Please keep these total number and casualty percentages, both received and inflicted, in mind as we continue looking at each of these groups, as they will indicate how important the role of these South Vietnamese territorial units and the American advisory mission was becoming as the war dragged on. In the last few years of the war, I want to point out that the RF force structure was strongly developed from separate companies to what they call company groups, battalions, and even what they call the mobile groups, or linh đội or linh đội, that I put the Vietnamese word on the slide for you at the province level. So one of the med advisor explained to me in an oral history that the difference between an RF battalion is that a battalion has 4 rifles companies and a heavy weapon section, whereas in a linh đội, they had 5 rifles companies, and they were more flexible and mobile. So, they would be ideal for being in a quick reaction force. In Vietnamese, lien, L-I-E-N, it means linkage or interconnectedness. And linh, L-I-N-H, it means flexibility. Đội, D-O-I, it means team. So I just want to explain a little bit of the Vietnamese linguistic aspect, so it's easier for the student to follow our masterclass. And also in this picture, you can see that some of the linh đội soldier, they wore red scarf. Some even had a very unique red emblem above their name tag to denote which element of the linh đội that they belong to. And I know that when you look at the picture, you can tell that their body size, was smaller, right? Much smaller than their American counterparts. But do not let the body size fool you, because research has shown that an average South Vietnamese infantry soldier often was 10 years older than his American counterparts, and often had 7 years of more combat experience than the American advisor. After all, these local South Vietnamese soldiers, they have been fighting, some of them have been fighting since as early as 1955 with the First Indochina War. So the second group of the med advisee that I would like to discuss is the PF, or the Popular Forces. And the PF unit, they have the roots back to what they call the Self-Defense Corps of around 48,000 men, which were created in 1956 under the Ministry of Interior. And again, looking at the number roughly here, you can see that their strength also was significantly increased in the years after 1967. The PF, they were originally organized as a cell, varying from 4 to 10 men per village. So, like let's say one village would have around 1,000 population, so they would have about 4 to 10 PF. And their tasks were to help maintain the security within their village, such as manning the outposts, guarding, some key military installation like bridges. Together with the RF, the PF also make a major contribution to the Allied effort during the war. They were arguably the most cost-effective military forces employed on the Allied side. They inflicted 30% of enemy combat deaths, but they received only up to 4% of the total budget. So that's why, we can argue that the RF, the PF, these, territorial unit, they were very cost effective. Match also advised and trained this last but not least very special group advisee at the lowest administrative level in South Vietnam society, the Hamlet level. And these were called the People's Self-Defense Forces, or PSDF. Here was the concept. The concept was that as the people can help to protect their own community and take over the role of, sort of like a home guard, PSDF would free other RF and PF for movement further out into the countryside or mobilize in joint operation with the Vietnamese regular unit. Again, looking at, statistics, the citizen soldier rose from around 1 million in 1969 to more than 4 million by 1970. And the advisory number also increased correspondingly with this build-up. For example, in 1967, you can see on the slide, there were 108 U.S. advisors attached to the militia. But in 1969, only 2 years later, you can see that 108 increased to more than 2,000. So the U.S. Army leaders created MAT and hope, right, that these advisors operating from a foundation of popular support would be able to encourage and involve these people more into the common defense of their own families and community. However, perhaps the most important and complex aspect, which often was understudied, and this is where I hope that my scholarship and research can help to contribute, is that this engagement and involvement had to be done, I argue, essentially in a Vietnamese way. We have to respect the local dynamics and not, be predominantly in an American way in order to yield any meaningful result for the South Vietnamese people, long-term peace and security. Again, going back to the book of Thích Nhất Hạnh, Lotus in a Sea of Fire. Who knows how to defend and preserve the Vietnamese lotus better than the Vietnamese people themselves? The fighting motivation of PSDF was rather complicated and just like, any other topics of this conflict. But we cannot undermine the important context of what they call the general mobilization after the Tet Offensive and the pressure to quickly expand the force level of the RVNAF or Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces in the face of U.S. withdrawal. The Saigon draft at that time was expanded to men from 18 to 38 years old. Now, put this in perspective, in the U.S., I think the range was from 19 to 26. So this is, like a bigger spectrum of people that they, the government wanted to draft into the South Vietnamese military. By the end of 1968, 1 in 6 adult males in South Vietnam had fought for the army. And the rest of people fall into 16 to 17 years old, or the older, people from 39 to 45 years old, they were called up for the militia or some technical support service. And recall veterans of either age brackets, if they have no documented disability, no specified length of required service, they also had to serve until the war is over. So basically, they would be serving for the whole duration of the conflict. Having said that, I want to discuss with the class about this, Vietnamese, a little bit aspect of the Vietnamese history and culture, focusing on the concepts of hieu, H-I-E-U, hieu, because, there was an understudy element of citizen soldier, child soldier. And these territorial soldiers consistently accounted for the lowest desertion rate because they were part-time soldiers. They lived close to their home, to their family, with an empathetic unit leader and lenient, flexible leadership style. These soldiers could go home to help with their family, working, let's say in a rice field during the harvest season. So their morale was usually high because they often had a personal attachment to their ancestral homeland and family. This is how a PSDF SWAT leader, a 37-year-old farmer in Khang Thang Hamlet in the Delta province of Ba Swing, answered when being asked why he joined the PSDF. He said, quote, I have 7 good reasons for devoting some 40 hours each week to the defense of my hamlet, my wife, our 5 children, and my home, end quote. To fully understand the territorial soldier morale and desire to serve near their homes, we have to have a deeper understanding of Vietnamese history and culture. Very rare any American soldier or advisor had this understanding before being deployed to Vietnam. For example, this concept, right, of hiếu is a moral obligation and devotion to the Vietnamese ancestor and family. As one South Vietnamese soldier explained, quote, my primary role in life is to provide for my family and to venerate my ancestor. It was very difficult to leave the village. I would rather have died with my family at home than leave them and could not, be able to care for them, end quote. So, by looking a little bit into this testimony, primary source, I hope that it helped you, the student of our masterclass, to understand a little bit more about the very important aspect of understanding Vietnamese history and culture. So that PSDF SWAT, right, who said that he had five reasons to defend his hamlet, was one of many other people that we refer to them as, in quotation mark, people in the middle, that Matt advisor got to work with very closely and help to defend and bring a safer, arguably a better everyday life for their family. Mobile advisory team advisor got to see very closely the cost of war, the horror, the sorrow that the war inflicted on these people at the bottom rungs every day. They got to ask and reflect about what this war was about from the bottom-up perspective that many other Americans did not have that opportunity. What the war was about? The answer can be very different, depending, on who you ask the questions. So, for example, if you ask a high-level politicians, decision maker, the answer would probably be falling, along the line of geopolitical concern, right? Some big concept like the domino theory during the Cold War. But what if you shift the perspective and you ask the same questions to the people on the ground? For example, you ask an American field advisor, like the Matt advisor, or a Vietnamese villager. And for many people, of these people at the bottom rungs, the answer was that the war was more about family safety, family survival. So in one of the letter, the South Vietnamese, soldier wrote to his wife. This is what he wrote, quote, the war is about you and our family. I know that the war will end one day and then we can resume our normal life, end quote. So this phrase, people in the middle, comes from an incredible memoir titled When Heaven and Earth Change Places, a Vietnamese woman journeys from war to peace, written by Lily Hayslip. She is a Vietnamese refugee, a writer, and a philanthropist. And this is what she wrote, quote, long before you arrived, My country has yielded to the terrible logic of war. What for you was normal, a life of peace and plenty, was for us a hazy dream known only in our legends, because we had to appease the Allied forces by day and were terrorized by Vietcong at night. We slept as little as you did. We obeyed both sides and wound up pleasing no one. We were people in the middle. We were what the war was all about. End quote. So I put that in that bubble on the slide, so it's easier for the student to follow. So this is a quote from When Heaven and Earth Change Place by Lily Hayslip, and I just want to encourage you to think, a little bit deeper about this concept of people in the middle and the human cost of the war. Civilian engagement play an instrumental role in the endgame of any counterinsurgency operations. In interacting with these, people in the middle, I argue that Mad Advisor went through a dual process of learning and unlearning. So they have to unlearn, right, the things that they carry either consciously or unconsciously into the advisor job, and realize that maybe, there were some biases or assumptions about the local population, hearts and mind that might be inaccurately comparing to their reality, everyday living in the village. They learn new things about these Vietnamese people at the village. For example, many American, GI, like grunts, like the enlisted soldier, had this assumption that the Vietnamese people had somehow become callous to human feelings after having to live, in a war zone many years. But in contrast, many Mad Advisors learned from their own observation that these Vietnamese mom, dad, just like any other parents in any culture, any country, they have a deep love and care. They love and care deeply for their children. Again, Mad Advisor, we have to remember, they were not there just to teach the local soldier how to shoot, a rifle. They were not there just to call in artillery and air support. My research argues that Mad Advisors were there as human, first and foremost, and represented somebody that's trustworthy and caring enough to provide specific assistance for the villagers for their everyday life needs. And therefore, Mad was an important part of the Vietnamese people's hope for peace. As you can see in one of the pictures on the slide, I think it's like the top one on the right top, a mother was burning some incense, right, in grief of losing both her con gái, like the word on the right side, as you may be able to read the Vietnamese word, it was written on the coffin, and con gái, G-A-I, is mean daughter. And the next coffin on the left is say con dâu, D-A-U, and con dâu means daughter-in-law. So at the same time, this mom, she lost both of her daughters. Mobile advisory teams saw this human cost of the war every day in their tour in Vietnam. Or in the picture at the bottom, you can see the wife and a child, like children, and even like, I think she will carry a baby to two childs, right? Children of a PF soldier came out to the bunker to visit and support their husband, their father, and she would take up the firing position if needed. Many Americans did not understand and often make fun of the local soldier wives, relatives, when they were hanging around criticizing them for affecting the soldier fighting morale. In reality, it could be the opposite. The argument is this: the close proximity of family was the strongest, if not the only reason for many local soldiers to carry on the fighting. If you learn about Vietnamese history, you know that we have many national heroines or female warriors who loved their country and fought until the last drop of blood for their country, such as the Trung sister, Bà Triệu. In Vietnamese tradition, we have a saying that giặc đến nhà, đàn bà cũng đánh, and it translates as when the enemy comes to their home, the women also fight. Is it important to study about these territorial female warriors beyond the conventional portrayal of their victimhood to the war? Because the history of these allied women complicates the representation of South Vietnamese female in the historiography of the war. Throughout my presentation, I'm sure that by now all of the students noticed that I always have a lotus, like a symbol of lotus on the slide. As many of you may know, Vietnam's national flower is the lotus. And usually this kind of flower, it grows in murky waters, but it always rises above the dark surface with very strong roots and delicate but sustainable petals, always aiming for the sunlight. In Vietnamese culture, we utilize every part of the lotus. You can wrap the rice around its leaf and you can steam it. The seed inside the lotus flower, you can make tea out of it. Like the stem, you can shred it and make a wonderful salad. So the lotus symbolizes the Vietnamese value of integrity, purity, and resiliency in hardship. I argue in my doctoral dissertation that those who served with math in Vietnam were among very few groups of Americans during the war that got to see and feel that lotus in the most, close-up and truthful manners for themselves. These advisors had an insightful familiarity and knowledge of their Vietnamese allies, not coming from any training material, manual, textbook, but this knowledge based on the countless, cross-cultural interaction, based on what the math advisors saw by their own eyes, how they felt by their own hearts. And, that was something very unique, very special that many other American service members never had. In this slide, I would like to discuss very briefly about some conceptual approach regarding two major concepts about the veteran post-war experience that often being conflated and rather, misunderstood somehow. So the first concept is the PTS, post-traumatic stress. PTS often described as how humans' ability, to process and regulate emotion was impaired by the prolonged and extreme trauma. PTS symptoms can include a variety of things like flashback, nightmares, hypervigilance. The second concept is moral injury. So think about it this way. If PTS is about what the war did to you, what the war did to a soldier in it, moral injury is on the other side, what you did to, what did you see the people, other people do in the war. So moral injury is not PTS. Is it possible for a veteran to have moral injury without PTS? A good book for our masterclass student to refer to check out about this two concepts is called Soul Repair. as I have put, the information and the ISBN number on the slide for your reference. The origin of this term comes from a Marine veteran, professor and philosopher by the name of Camilo Magdia. And he first used the term moral injury in his war journals from Vietnam. This is one of the definition about this concept from the book. Quote, moral injuries is the result of reflection on memories of war or other extreme traumatic conditions. It comes from having transgressed one's basic moral identity and violated core moral beliefs, end quote. So moral injury can cover, both combat and non-combat situation. Mobile advisory team veteran could be arguably suffer from moral injury from seeing someone else violated the core moral value, or they might feel, betrayed by person in authority who violated the mad veteran conscience or value and belief, that give meanings to the veteran life and, what had been their moral compass, what define who they are. It can be related to, if you were to witness a beloved human, someone important to you, such as the military local advisee, a counterpart that got killed, or witnessing, the South Vietnamese civilian or these RF, PF, PSDF that we talk about, these local counterparts and their family were terribly mistreated by other Americans during the war. That could also cause moral injury for mad advisor. You could argue that this is very similar to the survival guilt, another concept of regular troops, but in this case, whom the afflicted mad veteran has survived were not only, some of their beloved fellow Americans, but also countless Vietnamese civilians, villagers, translator, advisee, those people that the mad advisor tried to support in that very challenging war within the limited amount of time, during their 1 year tour of duty that they had there. Or, like I say, if the mad team were being rotated, they only have about 4 to 6 months with that village. So that even, more limited amount of time that they had. So usually, when we are talking about the counterinsurgency doctrine theory, people like MAD, Mobile Advisory Team, supposedly was sent to win over the hearts and minds, right? Hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people as another tools, in the American toolbox in support of the pacification. But my research suggests that what these small mobile unit advisors were really doing is not about winning, it's about learning to develop genuine empathy and gain a deeper understanding of what these hearts and minds really were first. So thanks to their proximity, working, living, fighting alongside the local unit, Mobile Advisory Team understood more of the Vietnamese people desire and struggle for peace that Thích Nhất Hạnh wrote about in his book Lotus in a Sea of Fire. And it's like a circle, the more they understand, the more they empathize with the people. And then the more they empathize with these local villagers, the more they would understand the Vietnamese people. In other words, the basic shared humanity deep inside each combatant and civilian is one of the key reasons for MAD advisors to be able to do their job in Vietnam. It is also the reason to help understand why some of these MAD advisors continue to struggle with things like moral injury after they already left Vietnam for many years. because they are humans and they have that humanity in them. They were capable of killing, shooting, but they were also capable of empathizing with others. So on the slide, you can see this very interesting pair of pictures that has shared with me by a MAD veterans. He came back to visit the village that his MAD team served in Vietnam province, and he found his own friend, a little boy that back then, who is now already became a father of 9 children. So the point is that the human friendship and historical connection is real, and we never know. We never know how many Vietnamese people, like this man, right, the young boy then, survived the war thanks to the support of MAD advisor in their village, and vice versa. We never know how many MAD advisor survived their tour in Vietnam, get out alive, go back to the United States to reunite with their family, thanks to the support of their Vietnamese friend, of the Vietnamese villagers. So by studying the war through MAD lens, we are returning the historical agency, and we honoring these people. We honoring that shared humanity to the American advisor, but also to the Vietnamese advisee. I argue that each MAD advisor experience matters because each of the Vietnamese people they interacted with also matters. And that is the end of my presentation. On the slide, I say cảm ơn. It means thank you in Vietnamese. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uyên, for such a wonderful lecture. Very interesting indeed. We truly enjoyed it, right, David? And I would like to make a comment, which is that I think that you, as a researcher, belong to a new trend inside Vietnam War studies that which is focusing in the human aspects of the conflict and the local people, especially, and not merely the analysis and narration of the combat operations, like at the old academics. We had in another masterclass a year before, Dr. Erin McCoy from University of South Carolina. You know her?
Yes, yes.
She's like you.
Yeah.
Her research also focuses on the people, on the lives of the human beings related to this conflict. So I think this is a new trend in the studies of Vietnam War, and the very interesting one, the one we need now, not only the one of the oldest scholarships. Okay, so congratulations. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And now I'm afraid it's time for questions and answers. We have 3 questions for you from the students, and possibly one from David or me or both. Who knows?
Very good.
Well,
thank you so much.
Let's start with the first question. Okay, the Geneva Accords ended the war and divided Indochina into Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam in 2 separate countries until a referendum on unification was held in 1956. Would it have been possible for the US to support France militarily so it wouldn't have been defeated at Dien Bien Phu, thus avoiding a more costly war for the US, both economically and in terms of human lives? What do you think about this?
Wow. So I think, thank you for your question. This is a very important aspect of the Vietnam War. And I think that in order to understand, to even start to try to answer these questions, I think that we have to look into the historical context. So by the time the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, they were already experiencing shortages of supply, even though the US had been supplying them with considerable amount of ammunition and military hardware. But the Vietmen, they had prepared. They were very well prepared to defeat the French by, they moved very heavy artillery, anti-aircraft guns into the mountains. And the entire world was shocked. They're not sure how. Guess what? They mobilized, right? Remember, it was a total war for the revolution, for the North Vietnamese. So they disassembled the large weapons and they used porter. They used the human, the people, to carry them piece by piece over the rugged mountain terrain. And therefore, the French could not send reinforcement by air and asked the US, right, for massive air assault. Now, we have to look, also into the US side, right? At that time, US President Eisenhower, he gave some serious consideration to the French request. And remember, I was someone who always, sort of endorse and articulate the domino theory, right? So he was very careful of not sending, direct military involvement in Indochina, because at that time, the entire country, the US, they just finished their Korean War, right? Very bloody and stalemate from 1950 to 1953. So even though he endorsed the domino theory, but he also do not, want to be directly involved. So again, that was a very complex historical context that we have to look into. I would also encourage students to think about this aspect of the Franco-US alliance, right? Because there was already friction from the US side. They had sympathy, right, from the people who were in Indochina at that time, in Vietnam, working, with the local people. So they had sympathy for Vietnamese independence, Vietnamese self-determination. At the same time, the French, right, like the French, they focus only on military, right? They only focus on military side. They want to hold on to their colonial holdings. So that, created a friction within the Franco-US alliance. So no. So my answer is that I think that no, the American would not have made a difference if we had supported the French even more than what we already had, because like I say, U.S. already recognized the Bảo Đại government. We already provide immense amount of military and financial aid to the French at that point, but the American stance remain firm that they want to supplement, but not supplant the French, and they want to be supportive of those, democratic value of self-determination, independence for the Vietnamese. So that, that key friction is still there. But thank you for the great questions.
Thank you. As a matter of fact, I teach a subject on Vietnam War at INISEG too. And I agree with you. The war for the French was already lost before Dien Bien Phu. No matter what they say, no matter academics what they say, before Dien Bien Phu, it was lost. So it was a matter, if they have had won at Dien Bien Phu, at least they could stay 1 more year, 2 more years, but no matter way, they would have been defeated. Okay. And by the way, you mentioned the heavy artillery, which was a surprise for the French. And there was at Dien Bien Phu, at the camp at Dien Bien Phu, the French camp, a colonel, which was the chief of the artillery, French artillery, who thought before the start of the battle, who thought that the Viet Minh was incapable of taking heavy artillery to the front, to Dien Bien Phu. And when he discovered that was wrong, he committed suicide. And before suiciding himself, he went walking through the camp, saying sorry to everybody. Sorry, I was wrong. Sorry, I was wrong. And then he committed suicide. Very interesting story and very sad story.
Very sad. Yeah. Thank you for
sharing. Well, second question from our students. President Nixon's withdrawal order was decisive because the simultaneous weak peace process at the end paved the way for the victory of the North Vietnamese army 2 years later. If Nixon's administration had remained firm in its support to South Vietnam with more troops and military equipment, do you think the war would have been prolonged or perhaps even won? Well, this is the same question about the French, but now about the Americans. What do you think?
Wow, yeah, this is a really good question. Thank you so much. I'm just really thinking about, next year, 2025, right? We will reach the 50th anniversary of, so of the official end of the Vietnam War. So this is an important question. So I think perhaps prolong, but not won. So one of the biggest strategic blunders was by allowing the revolutionary force, to remain south of the 17th parallel in those, Quảng Trị province and the other province next to it too. So again, so my approach, and recommendation to all students of our masterclass is that before you jump into trying to answer any questions, it's important to take a step back and look a little bit broader, take all of the nuances of the historical context into consideration. So 1973, right? When the Paris Peace Accord was signed, right? It was January. But before that, 1972, there was already, this big fighting with what they call the Easter Offensive of 1972. And one of the famous battles was the An Loc battle that a lot of, U.S. historians wrote about it, especially Dr. Jim Wilbanks. He was a advisor. He served in Vietnam, and he wrote, a lot of books about the An Loc battles too. And in that battle, you see, the role of the U.S. advisor. You see the role of the strategic bombers like the B-52 to sort of help to save the day. Even though, some of the South Vietnamese soldiers also fought really hard to defend An Loc. So taking that, into consideration, the Paris Peace Accord, it created this situation that South Vietnamese General Cao Văn Viên, he said that this is a half war, half peace. And why is that? Because, and I hope, the student can see throughout my presentation is that the Vietnamese cultural, Vietnamese history was very important for us, to understand about this conflict. For example, South Vietnamese soldiers, they would turn to protect their family first, right? And then remember the complexity of the civil war aspect of the conflict in Vietnam too. So South Vietnam government, at that time, they lacked a lot of legitimacy due to, a lot of their political, economic problems. There was pervasive corruption and very fragmented body politics. And they also over-relying, on the military general, to help them to run the country. So that was right on the South Vietnamese side. On the U.S. domestic landscape, you have this scandal, right, of the President Nixon at that time and the Watergate, and he, had to resign. At that time, heavy anti-war protests, broke out, and the U.S. domestic, the U.S. people support for the war was declining. So all of that, when you take all of these factors that I mentioned into consideration, you can see that it's a social, political revolution. It's not just a conventional military campaign. So therefore, it cannot be resolved only by military power alone, right? So so circling back to your question about, would Nixon, continue to support South Vietnam with troops, with material? Again, we are looking at this, from the angle of military alone, and I don't think that would change. Like I say, like perhaps prolong the tragedy and this conflict, but not winning, because the situation, is more complex than a military campaign, taking into consideration the Vietnamese culture, history, and the declining of U.S. domestic support, the strong resolve of the North Vietnamese side to unify, both North and South under their government. So, but thank you for the good questions.
Thank you, and we totally agree with you. It wouldn't change anything.
Yeah,
especially the winning phase. No, impossible to winning. But in any way, let's go to the third question of our students, and then I think David has a question for you. But well, first the third question, which is, in 1965, the U.S. sent its first troops and entered officially the conflict, confident that its overwhelming military superiority would bring it a quick victory. What do you think were the strategic or even tactical mistakes that led to the war being lost by the U.S. and South Vietnam?
1965. Thank you for your question. That were indeed like one of the key years. I'm thinking, so for example, thinking about 65, right? If you go back 1 year, 64, the insurgency in South Vietnam at that point during 64 was already strengthened significantly with infiltration from, PARVin or People Army of Vietnam, and NAV, and NVA, North Vietnamese Army, from the north to the south through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And during 1964, that already was going on and expanded. Most of them ran through Laos, right, like the neighbor countries of Vietnam. And then in the month before, the sending of Marines to Vietnam, they were VC attack, to a Marine base in Pleiku. So at that time, situation was very heated, right? And November, right? That November of 1964, Lyndon Johnson, he was running as what they would call a moderate candidate, right? And he would, receive advice from both his Joint Chief of Staff, the military advisor, but also his, civilian advisor. So, if you learn about Vietnam War, you probably know Robert, right? Bob McNamara. And the strategy that Bob, right, that McNamara gave to President Johnson at that time is called a graduate pressure. So they were hoping, that they would gradually pressure against Hanoi, right, against the North, to enable the U.S. to deal with Vietnam without interfering with what President Johnson had at that time, his vision for the domestic society, what he called a Great Society. And so in order to implement this strategy of graduate pressure, they will launch, the Rolling Thunder bombing campaigns that run from March 1965 to November of 1968 as a strategic, systematic, bombing. But that was, on the sky, right? But on the ground, the situation was also very urgent. Like I say, with the VC already attacked the Marine base in Pleiku and killed several Americans, wounded, 100 others, and damaged, some aircraft too. So the situation on the ground was urgent. So that's why they sent the Marine to first, to defend the Da Nang airfield. But of course, we know that after that, first mission, the whole, commitment of ground troops and everything was heavily escalated. So the reason that I want to provide everyone, with that bigger context so that you understand that moment of 1965, it did not, just happen overnight. There were like a series of things that led to that decision. But we cannot forget that the American military never considered the Vietnam War, to be strategically important enough to commit, total war. You know what I mean? Like total war, like World War II, right? So that's why, it's very challenging in a sense. For example, if you recall during my presentation, I talk about like the tour of duties, right? So for the MAD advisor or even enlisted, if you usually 12 months, 1 year, and maybe like 13 months for the Marines, but still it's limited. But remember when I talk about the South Vietnamese advisee, they were in it for the duration of the war. And so were the North Vietnamese, So I think that these frictions and challenges really really complicated the war. So the decision, again, going back to 1965 of sending ground troops to Vietnam, it really transformed the conflict in Vietnam into an American war. I hope that somehow answered your questions.
Yeah, of course.
All of these questions are really good. I really appreciate it, because in trying to answering it, it also helped me, to think, to reflect and think back about, a lot of things that happened in the course of the war.
Very thorough answers. Thank you very much. And I think by avoiding thorough war, United States, the meaning was avoiding war with China, especially. again after Korea. Well, now it's time for David's question. Go ahead, David, adelante.
Thank you, Juanjo. And my question is, do you think that the support of China and the Soviet Union to North Vietnam, to which they contributed $12 billion in surplus anti-aircraft, weapons, tanks, and munitions or granadas, will be decisive for the communists to win the war?
You mean like how much the China and Soviet Union had supported North Vietnam during the war?
Yes.
No, he's meaning if that support was decisive to win the war for the communists, for the Viet Minh. Sorry, for the Viet Cong.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Thank you, David. I think it's important strategically, but the key things, like is the people. And I admit that this might be influenced by my research. My research is about the bottom-up approach, right? But even, remember when I answer your questions about Dien Bien Phu, it's where the people underground, the porter, that transport these very heavy anti-aircraft guns and all of the military thing. So I think the decisive factors here was like the resolve, like the commitment, the sacrifice of the people. Otherwise, I don't think that with, of course, external support, right, with, the communist bloc, with Soviet Union, Chinese advisor, support in material, also very important. But at the end of the day, it's worth the blood of the Vietnamese, like the sweat, like the sacrifice. The whole conflict, when you think about, up and down that Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? You would have like Vietnamese soldier, North Vietnamese soldier who work on foot, for months down south, and also being separated from their family in the north too. Yeah. So my perspective, and someone might, disagree with it, but I think it's the like the internal, the internal factor, like the resolve, But at the same time, of course, I agree that the external support was very important. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. Very interesting.
Okay. Thank you, David, for your question. Thank you again to Dr. Uyên for her lecture and the answer to the questions. Very thorough, very well. But now I have, I'm afraid it's farewell time. But we hope to see you again soon, Dr. Uyên, in another masterclass with another subject related to Vietnam War. But there is a lot of things to study and to show to the people your research. So I'm sure that we'll have you again in another occasion, right?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, David. And
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our students of the masterclass.
Thank you, Dr. Uyên. And thank you to David for your contribution today. And
Thank you,
thanks finally to our audience, to you for being with us one more time. Please remember visiting INISEG's website, that is www.iniseg.es, to keep post about our next masterclass. So for today, I'm afraid I have to say bye-bye. See you next time. Bye-bye. Take care. Take care, Dr. Uyên. Bye.
Bye.